It is a South American way and the Teutonic way to have it the following way. Somebody is introducing somebody who's introducing somebody, and then there is no time left for the speaker. Dr. Canter has exactly 5 minutes until his time allocated is over, and I think I'll make it. The reason why I'm introducing David Canter is of a very personal nature. I've met him not a long time ago, a couple of days ago, and I have a very personal relationship to him, particularly through my daughter. Sonia was the first young lady, a born Winsonian, who greeted Dr. Canter at the bedside and asked him, can you read this to me? And he did. The book was on one side Japanese, on the other side it was English. He read the Japanese side. Dr. Canter is certainly a very widely traveled person. He had been for a year in Japan. He is originally from England, where he is presently the director of the master's program, which awards a master's degree in environmental psychology, a master's of science, I guess, in environmental psychology at the University of Surrey. When he was asked, how come that you're talking here at Muncie, Indiana? The answer was, well, I'm internationally known. He certainly is. He had lectured everywhere, almost everywhere, widely. He wrote various books, mostly about his field, which is man and environment, man-environment relations. His books are psychology with what? And the environment, and of course, psychology for architecture. Without any further ado, I'm introducing David Canter.
I'm very sorry, actually, because I've got no free holiday to offer you. We've a spare bedroom, and you're all welcome anytime you like. I've got no product to sell either. I'll tell you my problem. I'm a psychologist. That's not exactly the nature of the problem. But the first time I talked to architects and designers about environmental matters, I did the usual thing. I showed lots of graphs and statistical analyses, and I tried to demonstrate very clearly why I thought the nature of people was such and such, and how that could be taken into account. And the audience, those of them that stayed awake, managed to not really to ask any questions and to leave me at it. But afterwards, after I'd finished the lecture, one young architecture student did come up to me very tentatively, very hesitantly, and I thought, well, perhaps at least the spark of knowledge will be passed on to this young man, and he'd be able to take it further and live with it. And he came up to me and he said, very hesitantly, he said, I wonder, would you mind telling me where you bought your jacket? And that has always seemed to me to epitomize architecture. It's so easy to get caught up in surface matters. It's so that the people at the back of it all get lost. And so what I want to do in the short time available to me, in the next 4 minutes in fact, is to show you 40 slides. It seems to me all I can do is to try and demonstrate through the use of these slides what seems to me as a psychologist, and when as a psychologist talking to architects, I usually find I'm trying to talk on behalf of the people who use buildings, to try and demonstrate to you what I feel the nature of people is, how something about the way people work, and I hope that it might have some impact on the way you think about design. Now, I'm very caught with the problem of designing for leisure, because as in so many of these issues, the minute you take up the notion of leisure, you've made a whole range of assumptions. And it seems to me the most basic assumption that we're making is that there's some difference between what people do normally in their day-to-day sort of lives and leisure. That somehow or other leisure is something you go off to, you go to Disneyland for, or that you run away to. It seems to me that if this is a school of architecture and planning, then it's essential that we consider why it is people have to get the hell out of cities if they are going to have any leisure. And as also this assumes such a categorical distinction between the physical activities of people doing their daily work and their leisure activities, I thought I would go through my slides, which is the first thing I do whenever anyone asks me to give a lecture to architects. I go through my slides and have a leisure hunt to see whether I could find any leisure in any of my slides, and see if from that I could find out something more about the nature of leisure. But the question that I posed, that I quoted from John Lennon, a compatriot of mine, in fact, from the same area of Liverpool that I come from, so that makes me kosher, I hope. It always struck me as a very profound question. Why don't we do it in the road? And the question, when I began to look at my slides and to think about leisure, I got the picture of leisure breaking out everywhere. That in fact, if you walk around a town or a city, you can see it happening all over the place. It really is quite amazing these days. And it therefore began to dawn on me that really, if only given half the chance, cities and roads could become places for leisure. But we have to try and think more clearly what the nature of people is, whether they are little compartments that can be put off into the working situation and the leisure situation, and the two somehow can't mix, which is the basic idea behind cities. We've got to hide all our leisure activities away. Or whether or not there's some other possibilities for the future of town and city design. And it seems to me that these first slides, these buildings, these architectural erections, if you like, are... Oh, it's that sort of audience, is it? They indicate one approach to the whole leisure situation. And it's not in terms of the actual building itself and what goes on within it, but the fact, as is shown in this one close to home, it's about as close as you'll get, so you better enjoy it, in St. Louis. The notion there is that people will actually go and look at it. And it seems to me standing and looking is, if you like, the primal leisure experience, if you want to talk about it that way. And that this is the sort of thing that we ought to take as our starting point. The tower on this deserted plain, those probably remember, is from Expo. And this is Expo as I found it 6 months afterwards. Everyone had gone. This is I went through great trouble to actually go and look at it. And it seems to me that these elements, these events, if you like, in the city, which people will go and look at, is the first thing we should think of in leisure. If we have the next slide, we'll see. No, that's the next one on this side. Right. That building on your left, the Tange built in the middle, bang slap in the middle of Tokyo, is really a rather conventional office building inside. But it seems to me to illustrate something of the notion of how we can start moving these events, these great sort of exhibitions into cities, and start making cities places where people might actually actively take part in the city and enjoy certain aspects of it. And the next slide shows you the way in which you can take that a stage further, because I don't know if you can guess what this is or if you know it, but it is actually a library. And it seems to me to not only does it indicate the way in which you can turn libraries into great fun places, because it takes you half an hour to find out the way into it, that it really does indicate that going to read a book is really quite an event. It is something a bit more than the conventional sort of joining an institution. And if we go on to the next slide, you see this enshrined even more in this club in Shinjuku in Tokyo. And when we go into the next slide, you begin to see something of what this sort of thing implies about the city and taking part in things within the city. Because when you start getting close-ups and reflections of buildings opposites, a whole series of events that we normally go out of our way to. We go to art galleries, we will take bus trips to go and look through museums, we will cart things from one continent to the other to hide away in buildings that people then have to pay and go inside to look at, where they can become part of the city. The Japanese are really very good at this, I always thought. They're very good at the details of buildings. And if we look at the next slide, it seems to me this is perfectly, would be fascinating to see in a museum. It has a whole series of rhythms in it that are very interesting, and that really it's just a set of walls. And the next slide shows you that you can even do it with a fence. That the fence is an event, it's contributing to the city, it's something that you would go to look at. It's really is something that people can themselves turn into a leisure activity without it being consciously so. And one can follow this through in a whole range of details. Another Japanese example in the next slide is, to me, is a classic. This is all plastic and non-edible, needless to say. These things are outside restaurant windows. They make the whole business of choosing food, which is pretty intricate in Japan anyway, even for the Japanese, because you never know what the damn thing's supposed to be called. Relatively straightforward. You have to, if you don't speak Japanese, you have to go and pull the waitress out and point to the food, which obviously can lead to some misunderstandings. But beyond that, what it does is it brings the restaurant out into the street. The whole variety of foods which are available are there for you to deal with, and you can see what is going on and relate to that eating activity, which is another leisure activity that we seem to have to travel to the Caribbean to take part in from our earlier discussion. That seems to me ought to be very much more actively part of the city. Actually, the trick to thinking about going on a leisure hunt, if you understand what I mean, going around a city to find evidence of leisure breaking out all over the place, is to take a couple of children with you. And this gives me a great opportunity to show pictures of my family, which I haven't seen for a few days. Can we have the next slide, please? Seems to me, I didn't set this up. Well, I set it up the second time. The first time, they naturally started to use the environment. This small detail in the environment is a great adventure. It's a mountaineering holiday. And it seems to me that we make it too easy for ourselves. We by making the city such a neutral, uninteresting place, we have to go off to take part in things, that we have to go off and discover something. And you only have to take a few kids around a city and let them do what they want to, and they discover all sorts of aspects of details of the city that are interesting. And in fact, how many adults would like to take part in that, walk on walls and jump up and down over things, given half the chance? The next slide actually shows people doing it in the road. The thing is that these kids, on top of the toilet there, obviously felt they were doing something rather naughty. I went off to London with a camera to take photographs of people doing it in the road, hoping I could sell them on the international market. But much to my delight, I found these kids actually using a bit of the environment to have fun. And the view from up there is great. the view, it's an interesting perspective you get on a road. The number of people draw onto bridges over motorways in Britain just to watch the traffic going past is very great, and this is beginning to be institutionalised by restaurants that look over roads. And that seems to me to be one thing that we ought to start thinking about. The other small detail of the next slide, the small detail of the environment, and the next one, show, in fact, these two, that's London and that's Tokyo. But they both illustrate a small aspect of our cities that people take very seriously, going and feeding the pigeons, going to the park. There's a whole event, there's a whole range of family holidays and picnics and great adventures and discoveries going on in that little scene there. People making new friends without the need to have money to share with one another, having their own food which they brought with them, fitting into the local climate and taking part in the local activities. This might all seem a bit whimsical and might run me the risk of not winning a free holiday in wherever it was. But it seems to me, so long as we ignore these and what these give to people, we are going to need more and more to travel further and further to actually take part in any sort of recreational activity. This is a wildlife adventure for a 2-year-old. It wouldn't be very much difficult to make it more of a wildlife adventure for many other people. The next slide is actually something of a cheat, because this elephant isn't in the middle of a public square, as the photograph might indicate. He is actually in a museum. But the very bricks and mortar context of the museum, I think, helps to indicate how much fun it would be to have a few elephants dotted around. Instead of having to go off to museums to actually look at these things, why can't we have them outside where we can all see them, where they can contribute to the environment? And in fact, having said that, and having thought of that for this lecture, I then discovered in a local British newspaper that a chap has produced huge plastic hippos that he's dotted around a new town in Scotland, and everybody loves it. It seems to me an excellent idea. The next slide shows you another way in which the Japanese can do it, and if we move on to the next slide, you'll see them doing it. Yes, looking at the cherry blossoms. They make a whole event out of a naturally occurring event, out of a seasonal change. When the cherry blossoms come out along this rather smelly open sewer, everyone gets dressed up and goes out and has their photograph taken viewing the cherry blossom. And it seems to me there's a lot more opportunities for doing that sort of thing in cities than we take advantage of. The next slide shows the way in which they do this where there isn't something quite so natural. The details of this just small sub-area of Tokyo, in which particularly the decorations are changed with the season, so that you do in fact get the experience that you're taking part in a developing, naturally occurring event, and it's something that it's worth going to time and time again. And the next slide shows you, if you can get it in focus, another event, another way in which events are made in which people will actively take up the possibility of taking part in activities. Because if you look at the crowd of people here, and the focal character in it, who was telling a lot of very naughty jokes about the Tower of London, you see what the Tower of London has to offer, and people who go round the Tower of London, I think, will often remember these characters who take you round and have a very rapid-fire line in jokes, long after they've forgotten when the White Tower was built, who got killed in which and which room. It's the people who are prepared to be part of the locality and to tell you something of it, to express their interest in it, and the opportunity to interact with them, that begins to make areas events. The next slide, which I think is is delightful. It illustrates another way in which the Japanese can create events with the details, because these kids dress up a particular day on the year at great expense and go out to the local shrine to have their photographs taken. And the point is that you don't need to make this into such a total event. And what happens is we take this a stage further and start making into events and miss, and this is the point that I'm trying to make, we miss all the opportunities for making cities fun that might be available. If we look at the next slide, these guys are actually cleaning up the ice rink at the Rockefeller Center. And I think they're just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the people watching the people who skate there or any exhibitions that go on. This is totally free and open. And look at the number of people standing watching these guys clean up. And look behind the camera at the bloke taking a photograph of these people watching these people clean up. I mean, there's a whole series of things going on there that are very much integral to the particular activity. As I say, it's very easy to take this a stage further and to overdo it. And the next slide, I think, is a lovely illustration of a thing being overdone. Because this guy was our guide, and the bloke with the jacket on was our guide, and the whole ceremony we'd come to watch had been rained off. But we had a lot of American tourists with cameras. And so the guide very kindly went and got one of the people who was due to take part in the ceremony and helped him to put on his plastic costume. And the next slide shows you them all set up for the photograph, except they forgot to take the umbrella away. And this seems to me to illustrate very painfully how easy it is to overdo it and to change the nature of our cities, because it's so easy to sell a product. But the reason why we have to do that, well, we have to get to that, is something that we should be asking, and something that you should be asking yourselves as architects. The next slide shows perhaps the ultimate Japanese way of coping with the problem of the city, if you like. This is pachinko, for those of you who know it. These are very loud, noisy, often 2- or 3-story buildings, and all they have in them are these machines, just one machine, and all people do is stand like that, flicking balls in this machine. It's a sort of very simple-minded pinball machine in a way. And the pachinko parlor seems to me to take to excess the possibility of offering to people a particular venue, a particular activity for leisure. And the reason why this is necessary is because, if we look at the next slide, we see what so much of a city can be about. This is somebody waiting in an arcade in London. If you wait a minute, the next slide is much more interesting. Take a photograph. Here is somebody waiting, a couple of people waiting, trying to take this seems to me a major discovery on my leisure hunt. You see people taking part in this sort of leisure activity all the time. Why is it that these two sort of leisure activities is something that we forget, and that we just say, if you can pay whatever it costs to take off to Disneyland, then we'll start talking and think about it as leisure. But if we think about what goes on in a city, people waiting, taking advantage of the situation to read or to take photographs of any dollies who happen to be around, the opportunity for people to have a bit of a nap now and then. If we start thinking of people actively making something of a city, doing something in a city that is totally inappropriate, being totally fighting against what the city tries to make them to do, we can begin to see our way into opening up the city. And again, children often can open one's eyes to this, as the next slide shows. These trolleys are really a great treat for the kids. It always seems to me a terrible shame that they're not readily available in shopping centres and so on to push the kids around the car park while you're waiting, or because it makes the whole thing into an event for the kids. And I would have thought there are many situations in which adults would also like to take part in this. Well, at an airport, instead of having those long, meandering, moving pavements that they have now, wouldn't it be great to have trolleys that the guy who's sitting next to you on the plane, he pushes you for a bit, and then you push him for a bit. Actually, there was something that happened on British television just before I left that opens up the possibility here, because they were talking about the problem of having fire drills in multi-storey blocks of flats. And the notion that emerged was meet your neighbour at a fire drill. It seems to me the way in which you can take a situation, and if you think of it as a situation in which people will find the opportunity to do something. And the next slide shows you a chap putting up a multi-storey building, or taking part in some desert war, or making mince pies for dinner, or whatever. I mean, who knows what he's doing? But the point is that this seems to me a much more interesting escape to fantasy that we should look at as a model for our cities. What sort of opportunities can we give people? The next slide shows the sort of interaction with nature which is possible in my own study. Without even stepping outside of the door of my office, I can have a whole world going on. Often buildings in cities you don't face the right way, or it's very difficult to deal with the potted plant in this way. What about more interaction with wildlife? The next slide shows, I mean, I hope you don't mind looking at these pictures, but I quite like them. We gave the rabbit away because the kids lost interest. We had to swap it for a kitten. But it seems to me that there's a whole message in that picture about what is possible in cities, and the way in which cities are so constraining that you have to spend two days building a cage that you can get the kids into as well, so that the rabbit doesn't get away and you spend the rest of the week chasing it around all your neighbours' gardens. The next slide shows the archetypal British leisure activity. I did originally have this after the potted plant thing, and I thought somebody might think I was planting pot, but it's not the case. I've heard it said by psychologists that most psychologists have some area that they feel should not be studied, should not be open to investigation. It's a private area to them. And that idea has been presented to me, and I always denied it. I always said that I felt everything was open to exploration. Until I thought about gardening. It seems to me this is sacrosanct to me personally. It's something that enables one to interact with the environment, to see things develop and change at a scale that is within everybody's reach. And the fact that it's so difficult to do that in many cities, and the fact that, again, one has to get into all sorts of fantasy worlds before that sort of leisure activity can become part of our daily lives, seems to me something that the architects and planners must share the blame together with many other people. Finally, let's just look at one or two other of things that are done in the road with the next slide. The bookshops in the road, which become part of the urban scene, which enable people to take part in libraries without having to be hidden away. And the next slide is a unique American invention for doing it in the road. The Hare Krishna fellows, who seem to me to have added a whole new dimension to the urban experience. And the number of people who will stand and watch them, even though they think they might be peculiar, is well worth considering. The next slide shows a whole other sort of area, which is the market situation, which is another great activity, great leisure activity that we don't seem to use or to look for so much. And the next slide shows yet another activity. These guys this is actually in Hong Kong, but it could be in many, many places, a guy with some sort of little gambling event going on that other people can take part in, that turns various areas of the city into play activities. So that the idea of somebody going to work and coming home and then having to go off and do some leisure is destroyed on the way of delivering a letter or going to a business meeting. He can call in to Las Vegas. The next slide shows what I think is the archetypal example of doing it in the road, having your hair cut. Barbers and hairdressers generally could make a big contribution to the way our cities work if we took the notion that I'm trying to put over to you, that leisure is very much part of our daily activities. If you accept that people will actively try to make sense of the world, will actively try to do something in the world, will use every opportunity to explore issues and to see what's going on, then opening up various areas like these photographs and the next one, which happens to be a scribe in Afghanistan writing letters home for people. I'm sure you can all think of many situations. Wouldn't interviews with bank managers be much more fun and much more interesting if one could see them going on now and then, and it would certainly take a lot of the aura out of them. Many of the people and institutions which are bolstered by a particular environmental context, and in being bolstered, but in being made to seem important simply because of the way they're hidden away in buildings, also suck away from the possibility of the life which is a city. And the last two slides just show you things that you can do, that children will do with bits of their environment. The possibility of making something out of your environment, of doing something with it anywhere, is infinite. And I hope that I haven't pulled you down too far, but added a note of put on the brakes a bit to this whole notion of this leisure symposium, which frightens me a bit. The fact that architects thinking of leisure as something that they've got to go away and build on a desert island somewhere. I can't resist telling you that we did actually do a piece of research on this once. I hope you forgive me for mentioning that. But what we did is we went around various areas of Glasgow and we did some detailed observation of where children play. And we took areas where there were ordinary playgrounds, we took areas where there were adventure playgrounds, and we took areas where there were no playgrounds at all. And we watched where children play in all these different areas. And to our surprise, which shouldn't have been to our surprise, and certainly to the surprise of the architects who took part in this exercise, we found that children tended to play in the same place no matter what facilities were available. They didn't get hung up on swings and slides, and even the adventure playgrounds they soon lost interested in. They played where it was all happening, at road intersections where there was a chance of getting knocked down, where there were a lot of people running around, at places where they could see people doing things, where they themselves could do things and take part in activities. And they taught me a great lesson about cities, that the city is a playground to children, and the problem is that people think it's not and design it so that it's not, and as a consequence we have to fight to find leisure in the urban situation when it's there all the time. So I hope sometime you'll be able to join me doing it in the road. Thank you.